Welcome to the Wholehearted Eating Podcast, where non-diet nutrition, weight-inclusive care, and integrative health collide. We're your hosts, Dana Montes and Christina Hoyt, licensed integrative clinical nutritionists and body image coaches.
And we believe you deserve to have a joyful relationship with food in your body, even if you have a chronic health condition or symptoms that just won't quit. On this show, together and with our guests, we're bringing the real talk, no BS vibe with tangible tools to help you pursue health and wellness without obsession or restriction.
Remember our disclaimer, this podcast is meant for general information purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
Hey friends, and welcome back to the Wholehearted Eating Podcast. It's Christina here today, and I am so excited to share with you today's episode with Dr. Katja Rowell. Dr. Rowell has worked in child feeding for over a dozen years. She teaches the importance of responsive feeding and therapies to parents, pediatric feeding specialists, family support therapists, and childcare staff, and consults with corporate clients, nutrition education, and public health providers. Literally anyone who will listen. And today I'm so excited to have her on. She is the author of the book Love Me, Feed Me, and co-founder of Responsive Feeding Pro, a digital learning platform for feeding professionals focused on a responsive feeding therapy framework for children with feeding and eating challenges. Today, she and I are discussing the foundations of responsive feeding therapy method and how it intersects with Ellen Sater's division of responsibility. We also dive into how to create a more peaceful eating experience for you and your children, letting go of the power struggle, and how to foster safety and connection at mealtimes. Who couldn't use a little bit more peace at mealtimes with little kids? Let's dive in, guys. If you want to dive in and introduce yourself, that would be amazing. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, so my name is Katja Rowell, and I'm a family doctor by training, but for the last, I became a parent 17 and a half years ago. So that was really my entry into this work around feeding kids. And, as a family doctor, I'd been giving out feeding advice, and I really had no idea what I was doing. It was just sort of like, well, this sounds right, and here's what I've been taught or what I think is right. And so I realized with my daughter pretty quickly that I didn't know how to feed her. I knew kind of what, but it was that emotional piece, that psychology piece, her relationship with food, our relationship together. And I very quickly became very anxious about feeding her, and was I doing it right? And she seemed to be eating too much, and she was too big according to the growth charts. And so I tried to feed her from that place of fear and trying to get her to eat and take in less. And it backfired, and it was spoiling our relationship because it was focused around me keeping food away from her. So I had a food preoccupied toddler. And so that was my introduction as a parent. And so learning about a responsive approach and, letting her decide how much to eat and trusting her body in that process was like an absolute revelation in my personal life. And then just all these pieces fell into place in terms of my work in family medicine and just how much quality of life and suffering is happening around how we relate to food that I think is preventable. So I launched this second career into helping parents feed kids from a place of confidence and not from a place of fear.
Oh, I love that. And I like how I kind of, like most things, it comes from a place of our own personal lived experience and then learning and kind of growing from there. For people who don't know, since we kind of jumped right in, could you share a little bit about what is responsive feeding and how it kind of came to be to you? I mean, you shared a little bit of how it came to be for you, but could you share like kind of the basics, like the little Cliff Notes version before we dive in deeper? We're going to go all into it, but just a little bit.
Sure. So when I first learned about this, I learned about Ellen Sater's work and the division of responsibility. And I was part of that clinical faculty group for a couple of years. And so the division of responsibility was my introduction to trusting my daughter. And it was, that is a strategy where the parent decides what, when, and where children eat, and the child decides how much from what you provide. And it's incredibly powerful, and it was transformative. And However, as I worked with more and more families where they were saying, well, we've been in feeding therapy for 2 years, or we have this extreme picky eater, or my child is hoarding, or, my child is autistic, or whatever the challenge was, I felt like it needed to be more flexible and more accommodating. And so I really dove into learning with speech therapists and occupational therapists and learning about the sensory piece and psychologists. I'm really lucky to be part of a great team that's kind of forming this responsive feeding therapy and defining it and applying it. And so it's more overarching in terms of, to me, the underlying foundation of responsive feeding is that we protect the child's autonomy. So there are 5 values from the responsive feeding world. So it's protecting the child's autonomy. It's focused on the relationship between the parent and child primarily. Focuses on the child's sense of competence and confidence. So those are the 3 kind of basic needs. That's a psychology term for humans to thrive, is having autonomy, warm, attuned relationships, and competence. And then when those are in place, it supports the child's internal drives to eat. So that's being able to tune in to hunger and fullness cues, curiosity, pleasure, soothing, all of these different reasons why we eat. And then the 5th piece is looking at, everything that's going on for children, that whole child lens. So what's happening at school? What about if there's food insecurity? How do we feed kids when maybe money's tight? We're not, exposing to 15 different heirloom tomatoes. So all of these different pieces fall together. And then what I love about the responsive piece, so the division of responsibility, sort of here's parents' jobs, here's the child's jobs, and that's absolutely valuable. But to me, the language of being responsive puts the focus on the warm and attuned adult, observing what's happening with the child and then responding to the feedback they're getting in the moment. And so, and I think this is so important when parents get advice like, well, you just put milk out and say, well, everyone's going to have milk today for lunch. And so if your child sits down and drinks that milk happily and you have this wonderful meal, fine, that works for that child. But when I tried this with my daughter, it was like, I got immediate and intense pushback. And so then I'm responding to how my child, with their temperament, with their sensory needs or their preferences, or just that day, I can respond in the moment to what's going on. To me, it's just this framework where we're prioritizing enjoying our kids, having that connection, the love, the care, the connection, and then the food is not the primary thing that we're thinking about when we're feeding our kids.
Yeah, one of the things that I really took from your book, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, but the book is called Love Me, Feed Me, and I'll share it in the show notes and everything as well for everybody. But one of the things that I really liked is right from the beginning, you say it's really about supporting a healthy feeding relationship. And that made me think immediately about how so often when anyone, like, a parent or even for yourself, we tend to think of healthy feeding, and I use that in quotations, of what instead of how, and how focusing on how can actually create that deeper connection, and as a result, a more broader, maybe a healthier feeding relationship with your children. And that doesn't necessarily always have to mean eating what you want them to eat. And I think that's really hard for parents to let go of that piece. Could you talk a little bit about the what instead of how?
Absolutely. I think this is so important when we focus on, and usually it's vegetables, right? When we focus on, I have to get, 3 colors in, or I have to eat the rainbow, or this many different fruits and vegetables. When we focus on that, we often lose the connection, because then we have an agenda. So we go in with, I want her to eat X, Y, and Z in this meal. And that necessarily, when we have a goal or an agenda, invites distraction from connection, and it invites pressure. And it's really fascinating to me. I am seeing more and more on social media these sort of kid nutrition experts saying, well, don't pressure your child to eat, but instead make it a game. So let's see who can put more blueberries in their mouth. Let's see who can crunch this the loudest. Can you crunch this louder than me? Look, let's paint with, let's stamp with the blueberries. Oh, look, when I open it up, it's green inside. And like this constant commentary, even if it's fun and playful, is kind of a message that I want to get across here. If we go in with the agenda of like, this meal is only successful if my child eats, 1 to 3 blueberries or whatever it is, it sets up conflict and it sets up disappointment. And children will feel that. They will sense that going in. And there's great research. There's a PhD researcher, Hazel Wolstenholme, who's actually interviewed children around the parents' agenda, and they say things like, I know my mom's frustrated. I know she's angry. She tells me I used to like this, but I know she's just trying to get me to eat it. So kids are very clever, and they know when we come in with an agenda. And that, unfortunately, that short-term meal-to-meal agenda and trying to get them to eat a certain way, I think really slows that process down for kids in terms of expanding variety.
100%. I mean, I see with my own toddler, my daughter, she sometimes she's a holder, if you will. So she sometimes doesn't always go to the bathroom. And so, the nutritionist in me is like, oh gosh, we got to get her to going to the bathroom more. And then I got focused on fiber. I'm like, we got to get all the fiber in. And every time I went against my approach for being responsive and being division of responsibility approach to it, every single time I tried to push this kid to have broccoli or to have blueberries or have anything that had, it always ended up, and this is a kid who likes those foods, who doesn't usually push against it, but immediately it becomes like this whole game around control. And I remember one day I turned to her and I said, I don't really like pushing you to eat stuff, and I really don't want to do that. So we're done. We're done doing that. We know that we need to go potty every day. So we're going to work on going potty every day, and we can do it in other ways, but I'm not going to fight with you about food. And it was immediately like, she was just like, thank goodness that party's over. And I think it's really hard because as you mentioned in the book, you describe it so well with calling it the worry cycle. And I think as parents, we do get stuck in this, well, they're saying that I need to do this. And so then this feeds my own internal worry that then creates this whole cycle that comes about it. Can you walk us through the worry cycle and how it kind of prolongs this struggle and that loss of connection with our kids at the table?
Absolutely. So, it's a little diagram that I had made for the first edition 10 years ago, and it describes something that it's in the research. We know that this is described in the research, this dynamic, and then I saw it with my clients all the time and in my own home. And so, it starts with the parent, or rather it starts with a child who maybe has some feeding differences, or maybe there's a challenge. So for you, it was constipation was the challenge. And sometimes it's a perceived challenge, like I think my child is too big or too small, or they eat too much, or they eat too little. And that's something I hope we touch on, is these misperceptions where there's so much worry where there doesn't need to be. So, but sometimes there is something to worry about. So then, hopefully you have a doctor who will help you look through that. Not often the case, but so we have a child who, for whatever reason, there's anxiety, there's a sense that, we have to help this child to eat or deal with something. And then we as parents, and again, I've been there, so I have empathy. We don't necessarily know what to do. We hear you have to make them try it 10 times, or you read an article about how important DHA is for brain development, then you panic because your child isn't eating, 1 to 3 servings of fish a week or whatever it is. So we as parents get bad advice. We don't often get helpful advice from the people we turn to when there are problems, the family doctors and pediatricians. And I'm a doctor, so I feel like I'm in a position to call my colleagues out and to empathize with them because we didn't get trained in any of this stuff. So then we have the parent who's like, I don't know what to do. Let's take one example. A client's underweight, quote, baby was sent home from the hospital, and the pediatrician said, do whatever you have to get X number of ounces in a day. So we have this terrified dad. She's not eating well. And what he ends up doing out of his fear that she'll need a feeding tube is, clamping her head down with his one hand and forcing her to feed the bottle. And she's coughing and, choking and turning different colors. And, the most loving, engaged, they're feeding pumped breast milk. And then what we see is the child resisting or pushing back for all kinds of reasons. So in that case, the baby was pushing back because she was protecting her airway, and it was a very unpleasant, unconnected feeding. So then the child pushes back, and maybe it's like my daughter pushing back against me saying, you have to have milk at lunch today. So kids push back for whatever reason. And then it seems to reinforce to the parent and the adults like, ooh, this child can't do this thing, so now we have to try harder. And the visual is like a spiral in the middle, because parents that I worked with said, you know what? Feels like we're circling the drain, or it feels like a black hole, and we need a hand out of this. And so that's a very typical dynamic, whether we're trying to get kids to eat more or less or different foods. And we have really good research that says that, while at one meal, bribing with dessert could get that one bite of, blueberry in, over time, it actually becomes counterproductive, and kids eat less well and are more prone to having, dysregulated weight gain.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes so much sense. And I also want to empathize with the parent who is going through that with their infant feeding. When you're told to do whatever you have to do and you care about your child and you want them to thrive, you'll do just about anything to make sure. And you're sleep deprived on top of it. And, all kinds of decisions are getting made. And it's really overwhelming. And I feel like that circling the drain kind of analogy can feel so real. And I imagine that there's so many parents listening to this thinking, wow, thank you. Someone's finally talking about it. I want to touch back on what you mentioned earlier about the misconceptions, because I don't want to forget about them. And I think that there are times where we think that it's actually a problem. And then we get hyper-focused on it, and the pediatrician gets hyper-focused on it, or their coach gets any number of person gets hyper-focused on something. And then we perceive that as something that we need to fix. And a lot of times too, I do think as a parent, I've talked about this with another guest on a previous episode about how sometimes feeding can feel like a parental scorecard in a lot of ways. And so I'd love for you to talk about these misconceptions and what's real and maybe what's not from a physician standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. I have a little notebook. I'm like, I want to talk about that scorecard, and I want to talk about this. And so one thing before I jump into the misperceptions is the scorecard thing absolutely is true, especially with social media. And there's so much attention, right? If you have the bento box with, the one M&M in the middle, and then it's filled with peppers and berries and whatever else. Or on social media, I once unfollowed a friend who posted, I was salty that day, and she posted like her 2-year-old drinking a green smoothie, and she said, Mama's doing something right. And it just rubs me the wrong way, because if for whatever reason you don't have a little foodie drinking green smoothies, the implication is mama's doing something wrong. So there's so much blaming, mostly falling on mothers. And it does feel like a scorecard. And one of the most, I think, harmful talk about scorecards is the misperceptions around growth and weight in particular. And it feels like a report card. It feels like you walk in, the first thing they do is weigh your child and then plot it. And they're either, in the red zone or the green zone, and like, that's a whole 3-hour thing, is talking about growth charts and these labels and BMI. But it feels like everyone has forgotten that humans exist on a continuum. There have always been, there will always be higher weight children and lower weight children. But we've sort of reduced this to where a kid plots on a growth curve. And so, quote, normal or healthy weight is like average plus, one, bringing back some, statistics and biology terms, but average is sort of healthy plus or minus one standard deviation, right, on this statistics thing, which gives me hives. But, and then any kid above the 85th percentile is now abnormal or unhealthy. And that is the current cutoff for, quote, overweight and obesity, which are terms I don't like. They're stigmatizing and they're not clinically meaningful for the individual. And then we have, the same on the bottom end. And so when your child is growing at the 10th or 20th percentile or the 90th percentile, if that's roughly where they've been growing, they're just smaller or bigger than average. It's not abnormal for that child. And so much of the nuance is lost, and we're mislabeling smaller than average children and larger than average children as having unhealthy bodies. And then it turns the child's body into a problem to solve. And, and this is incredibly, incredibly harmful. Something I was surprised to learn about is that actually most kids in the first year will move around on the growth chart quite a bit. Like they go from 10th to 50th percentile or 50th to 10th percentile. And that's called discontinuous growth. But now there's such a focus on growth charts that they look at that and go, oh, 10th to 50th, they're gaining too fast. I've literally had parents of exclusively breastfed infants told your child is gaining too quickly, or they're, quote, I guess we have to use it because we're on the radio. They're obese. So cut out a nighttime feedings or make them wait half an hour after they seem hungry. So we're not responding to children. And in fact, parents are being told to ignore the child's cues. They're being told to use non-responsive feeding practices. So with the caveat, of course, that any weight loss to me is really an urgent situation. And if kids are, going from 50th to 10th percentile, that warrants a full, history, physical exam, lab results as necessary. But at least a subset of kids who are moving around on the curve are being mislabeled, and with really bad consequences. Because that then is, your kid's too big, make them eat less. And then we get in the worry cycle. Parents try to restrict them, then they get food preoccupied, which is how I found myself with the food preoccupied toddler. Or your kid's too small, get them to eat more, and then we see, eating less well over time. So the biggest misperception to me is around weight and growth, which is why I spend like pages and pages on it in the book, because I want to reassure parents, and often we can. And then the other two misperceptions are around how much the child is eating. And another one is misperceptions around nutrition, like, protein. Parents tend to really overestimate how much protein children need. Parents worry that sugar is addictive, and it's not. And so there's a lot of worry about protein and salt and carbohydrates and all of these different things where a lot of the time parents don't need to worry.
Yeah, I think that's a really great thing to point out to parents, that sometimes these things that we get focused on are things that we don't really need to be as focused on. And that if you look at your child over the year, over a longer period of time, they probably are getting a little bit of everything, but we go into it at what the plate needs to look like and what that needs to be. And I think that can be really overwhelming. And as far as the early on feeding and restrictive feeding for even an infant, as someone who has postpartum depression and anxiety, what a way to turn that one on, to go in both times that both of my children had feeding issues from the get-go. My first, not as much, because I think it ended up being more of a lactation thing, but it led me down a road of being so anxious and worried about things that ultimately, I remember the day that it changed for me, my friend turned to me and she said, "This doesn't look like a child who's struggling to eat." And I remember saying that, like, wow, you're right. She's not crying. She's not upset. She's just gaining at her own rate, and I'm going to let it go. And it was, that changed everything. And then with my most recent, um, it it has taken her a long time to gain, and she was dropping in percentages. So it was a little worrisome. But talk about turning on that anxiety. And then the things you would do when they do tell you, well, make sure you're getting in 25, 30 ounces of milk, and maybe you shouldn't be breastfeeding anymore. And all these types of things come over and kind of take over. And it really does turn away. I remember my mom said to me, she said, "What point are we force feeding this infant?" You know, she's like, "Are we force feeding her?" And I and it wasn't like I didn't feel like I was necessarily force feeding her, but I needed to offer, you know. And so to me, it was always about offering it and saying like, okay, she gets, you know, distracted and wants to see what her big sister's doing and things like that. But I think that is the responsiveness, is like observing who they are and their personality instead of getting focused on the numbers. But as a parent, if we are looking at it as a scorecard and we have a propensity for anxiety or perfectionism or anything like that, I mean, ding, 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 all of the lights turn on. And I feel like there's only one way to go than to hyper fixate on this thing, because we feel like it says something about us and our child and our ability to parent. And we haven't even gone to the more teenage years and the neurodivergent children, where it feels like even more of a struggle. And I would love for you to talk more about that and how this shows up in neurodivergent children and those families a lot.
Yeah, and I just want to first recognize, so I'm not going to do what you want me to do. I'm going to first.
That's fine.
Because what you said was so meaty about anxiety and depression, and there is a lot of social pressure now to breastfeed, and not necessarily a lot of support, and yeah, I mean, we had horrible breastfeeding problems, and I'm convinced, had I not given formula on day 4, a lactation consultant came out to our house, that she would have been hospitalized with high bilirubin, and it absolutely I don't want to. I've had few major issues in my life and challenges, but not being able to breastfeed my daughter was like this black hole for me. It was the closest I've come to a clinical depression. And that was, it goes to the core of who we are as parents and as mothers, particularly with breastfeeding. There's the feeling of I couldn't do it. And so, and looking back now, I think I also had some postpartum depression, and that was definitely worsened with our breastfeeding struggles. And, a month in, my husband brought my daughter to me, and he's like, "She's being so cute." And I was pumping, and I was like, "Get out, I'm pumping." And that was such a wake up call of like, I'm missing this. And and I still look back, I think there is a lot of preventable suffering, which looking back, I wish I could have known then what I know now. But so absolutely, if you have that propensity for numbers, for achievement, for anxiety, and you go to the doctor and, we're still in the red zone, it really hits you to the core. So, so for parents, to process that and to get some support around that, hopefully. Yeah, and there's so many things. Sorry, and even just going out and having someone say, "Oh, look at your cute little peanut," or your little peanut, or your chunky monkey. Like when you have a kid who's growing at the extremes of the growth chart, if they're bigger or smaller than their peers, it's like constant comments about what or how much they're eating, and so that just piles on to the feeling of like, "Oh, I'm not doing something right." So if we think about when challenges or sensory differences or neurodivergence comes in, this is where I think the flexibility piece is so important, and maintaining that connection. And really, this is where that felt safety piece helps us too. So what are we observing in our child? I've talked about like we're attuned and we're observing our child. And what we're kind of observing is their emotional state, their nervous system, what's going on with their bodies. Are they at the table and they're wide-eyed and they're breathing really fast and they're leaning back and they're, you can tell they're in distress? Or are they Are their bodies calm? Their breathing rate is typical. They're making eye contact. They're, if that's something they typically do, and they're engaged in a way that indicates that they're in their place of calm. And so that's another really helpful piece, I think, whether you have a child with, sensory differences or not, is, are they in their felt safety zone? Are they calm? Do they feel like, does it look like they feel comfortable and happy to be at the table? And that's a huge piece of the puzzle. When kids are in that zone of felt safety, then they're able to listen and learn and access curiosity and access signals coming from inside their body more easily. So even if, say, there are challenges with feeling hunger or fullness cues, you're not ever going to be able to access them the same way if your heart rate is 180, your blood pressure's up, your body's flooded with stress hormones. And so that is a really important piece, whatever's going on, is to ideally have the child be able to be in a calm, sort of centered space at eating times.
Yeah, I love that. You actually kind of partly quoted one of my favorite quotes from the book, where you said that any health benefit of a few bites of broccoli in a flooded body with a body flooded with stress and stress hormones, increased heart rate, blood pressure, and tears is pretty much lost. And as a nutritionist, I have to say thank you for stating that so clearly, because the child's not going to digest and assimilate and utilize those nutrients when it's in a stressed environment. So it might feel like a win that they've taken a couple bites, but really it's not a win, because one, they didn't really get the nutrients, and two, we've created an environment where broccoli now becomes this new control mechanism and this new way to feel unsafe in a lot of ways. And the last thing we want to do is for our kids to feel unsafe when it comes to eating. It's such a important piece of our lives. It's how we thrive. And I'm thinking about, for parents who maybe are like, okay, I hear you. We have a very stressful dinner table experience right now, and that's how it is. What can we do to start to shift that? Do you have any advice for kind of setting a new tone at the table moving forward?
I think the first thing is for the parents to sit and really think and reflect. And so I recommend journaling for parents that are really struggling with feeding, and to ask yourself, what am I worried about? What am I worried about in terms of, we're trying to get kids to eat. So I guess the first question is, what's happening at the mealtime? And usually it's power struggles over trying to get the child to eat certain amounts or certain foods. So let's say that's what's going on, is, okay, we get to the table and I want them to have 2 bites of a protein. So they have to eat that before they can have more of the food that they want to eat, whatever the power struggle is. So reflect on, what am I trying to get them to do, usually that they're resisting, and then why? Why am I trying to get them to eat the protein or whatever it is? And then, do I need to worry about that? So finding more resources, and hopefully we've given a little bit of some reassurance here. So whether it's a book or, how much protein does my child actually need? And it's the one nutrition formula I put in the book, is sort of how many grams of protein roughly per year of age, because almost all of the parents of picky eaters, where they worry about protein, when we sit down and math it out, the child is getting more than enough protein. So what are you worried about? Do you need to worry? And if not, what can you let go of? This is this tugging and this pushing that you described so well with your child, that whenever you tried to get her to eat fiber-filled foods, it was like completely backfired. So spending some time observing what happens when I say, okay, you don't have to eat it, but I want you to just lick it, or I want you to take 1 bite of this, or a no thank you bite, or you need to eat X before you can have dessert. So when you say these things, also, how is your child reacting? And usually just that awareness can help for a lot of families to say, okay, well, we're going to try something different. So the other piece is then, what have you been doing so far? List out all the things you've been trying to get them to eat more, less, or different foods, and sit with it for a while and go, this is where you Dr. Phil yourself and say, well, how's that working for us? How's it working? And if it were working great, you wouldn't be doing this. So, and then get some resources like podcasts or books or whatever to try to do things a different way. So I'm going to let go of the rope. I'm going to put the food out that we're serving, including something I know that my child usually eats, one or two things maybe, and I'm going to put it in the middle of the table. If my child is able to self-serve themselves, then that's a really useful tip in terms of neutralizing battles at the table. So I'm moving on now from reflection to what can parents do. So the first thing would be to stop pre-plating. That's the number one tip that families tell me neutralizes immediately half of the power struggles. Because if you've pre-plated and you set the plate down, immediately, generally you might hear, I don't like that. I don't like that. That's touching that. How much of that do I have to eat? How many bites of this before I can have my Oreo or whatever it is? So when we stop the pre-plating, we've neutralized the battles and the negotiating, and the child can actually sit in that calm state rather than immediately going to anxiety and what do I have to eat? What am I going to have to do to get my dessert? Then we're out of that curiosity zone and we're out of the zone of connection and autonomy. So we're supporting their choice with self-serving, including options that they like. And then for the parent, it's recognizing also that this is not going to be immediate. So it's sitting on your hands or not saying anything for the 3 or 4 meals where they don't take that blueberry onto their plate, or the 3 or 4 months where they don't do it. Mm-hmm. That's the really hard part, is I think also when parents hear you shouldn't pressure, they try it for a meal or two or a weekend, but they're still bribing with dessert. So I have parents come back and say, well, I tried what you said, or I read this blog post and I didn't pressure for a weekend, but he didn't eat a single fruit or vegetable. But they're still commenting about it. They're still sort of sales pitching. They're still, encouraging, or they're still withholding dessert. Or so there's a lot to it for families. So I would encourage families to learn more. The second piece is, if you are serving something sweet at meal times, to serve all foods with the same emotional energy. So the potatoes, the chicken, the Oreos all have the same emotional energy, and serving the sweet with the meal is the number 2 tip that families say helps neutralize all of that negotiating angst and power struggles. So the Oreo or 2 is on the napkin next to the empty plate, and kids can serve themselves. And yes, they'll probably eat the Oreos first for a while. And then as the sweet begins to lose its power, we see kids, often going back and forth or being able to manage. And having that neutral approach to sweets is super important in terms of like taking it off its pedestal. Because when we have kids earn dessert by eating certain foods, research suggests, and our, observing our kids, that it actively makes them dislike the stuff we want them to eat, right? That they have to slog through to get to the dessert, mm-hmm. and it actively makes them more focused on sweets. So those are kind of some practical tips to get started with.
No, those are wonderful. And I think even for myself, I see it too with my daughter, and I've seen it with other people as well. And I think it can be really helpful to the not plating for them is huge. Every time we've ever done a buffet style dinner, which I try to do most of the time, but sometimes, it's a quesadilla and it's there or what have you. And I think one of the things too is that sometimes it is difficult because we're parents and we're like, well, we're going to, serve at the stove. We're not going to put anything in these things. We're not going to add all these added dishes. But I think if you are having a child who's having a difficult time, or you're living in this worry cycle, taking the extra plates and having a little extra serving dishes is totally worth the energy in order to do that. And I have definitely seen neutralization of sweets being awe. Like it's like it can sometimes sit there and you can see your child and it's an awe, like a complete awe of the way that they interact with it. And sometimes when you see it, when it's used differently in other people's homes and how they all of a sudden shift. Like our daughter came home and said, "Hey mom, can I have a treat after my dinner?" I'm like, "Well, when did we ever do that?" Like, what are you talking about? And it's clearly something that she learned in someone else's home. And so it's interesting, like how they carry it forward and how you have to kind of, work on it even at home and just making sure that you don't kind of do that at the same time. But it's so well worth it to do that. I will tell everybody that it feels instinctually really hard to do as a parent, because I think the last thing I was going to ask is for all the parents who are listening, I feel like there's probably some people who are like, but what about their health? But what if like this worry is something that I feel like is actually a worry and this feels too blasé, and to like, how do I truly let go of that if I've been told by the authorities and the people that I trust and or hired, they're feeding therapists, they're early interventionists, they're all the different pieces that might be feeding into this, their physician, all the different stuff. One of the things that I really liked that you talked about in the book too is the concept of what's important now. And I would really love for you to explain that a little bit and how that looks in application when you're at a meal. And for the parents out there who are kind of like, well, this sounds awesome. I love the idea of not having a battle, but I'm nervous about the things that I'm worrying about. And I hear that they're misconceptions, but they don't feel like misconceptions to me. What kind of advice do you have for them?
I mean, I've been there, right? When we, I get it. This is really scary stuff sometimes. And, when I started with not limiting my daughter's portions and doing this sort of, I'm putting the food out, and if she wants more, I give her more. And she was a year and a half, sometimes eating more than my 6'2" husband at meals. And I think, if you're really struggling with this, learn more before you jump in, because otherwise the first transition period is kind of scary. So my daughter ate a lot for a while. And if you don't sort of know the research, or that's why my book too is full of a lot of research. It's like, hey, and stories from parents who've been there. That's a super important piece of it, is like, I get it. And I sort of white knuckled it. There were meals where she'd want more of this, we have this little turkey curry. I remember this so well, like more, and I'd put a second helping, more, a third. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to stop her. And then this is the piece where if you can get to seeing early signs of progress, it's and know what to look for, it's really important. So I remember so well that like more, and that I think third or fourth serving that I put on her plate. So that's the other thing with family style, is you can serve children in ways that are responsive. So there's flexibility there too. But so I remember putting it on her plate. She had one bite and then said, all done. And that was a child who'd never on her own said all done. I was always limiting to what I thought a reasonable portion was. And so we have to allow them to get to that point of being able to tune in again and to decide. They are the one who decides when they're stopping. And that's really scary. And so, first off is having guardrails in place. If you have a child who's not eating a lot where you are worried about weight, like, maybe don't change everything at once. Do one thing at a time and then observe. And certainly, if weight is low, if you're someone where like, oh, we are thinking about maybe this child needs a feeding tube, working closely with your healthcare team. But so what's important now is, again, the felt safety at the table is the most important piece, I think, during this transition time. And so early progress will be, my child is actually sitting at the table for 10 minutes instead of being there for 30 seconds and immediately saying, I'm full, and running to get away. Or it might be for the anxious eater, like playing with food or serving a parent. So I have lists in the book of like, here's early progress. If you have an anxious eater, like maybe it's that they're watching you eat, or they're curious or asking questions about food, or they're eating larger amounts of their preferred foods. And so it's important to know what early progress looks like before the anxious eater maybe eats more variety, or before the food preoccupied child tunes in and says, I'm done. With food preoccupied kids, and that is where the child's interest in seeking of food interferes with, the work of being a child. They're the kid at the party who's just grazing on everyone's snacks, or is not playing. They're, glued to the buffet, or they're constantly whining or asking for food. And the first thing you might see is that they play between meals and they forget to pester you about food or ask about food. Or instead of eating everything on their plate in a minute and a half and then begging for more, maybe it takes them longer to eat. And maybe, one client said, my child bit her toast into the shape of a fish and was playing with it. And that's a huge sign of progress for a child where a month earlier just shoved it in her face as quickly as she could out of that anxious energy. So I think it's really important in terms of focusing on what's important now is that felt safety. Are they calm? Because that's the space, again, where they can tune into what's going on in their bodies and all of those other drives to eat. And we know from adults that that tuned in or intuitive eating or internally driven eating is linked with all kinds of positive outcomes versus, I'm going to eat what my Fitbit tells me, or my, Weight Watchers app, or whatever it is. And so this to me is really setting up the space for kids to be able to tune into those cues to the best of their abilities. But knowing what early progress is for food anxiety or for food preoccupation, and looking for that and celebrating that is really important to sort of help keep faith in the process, because it's a bit of a leap of faith at first. Yes, if I stop bribing with dessert, he is not going to eat that cucumber for a while. And another piece I wanted to say is there's so much about exposures, like, oh, you have to try it 10 times. And the piece that gets missed, and I just was doing a talk for feeding therapists, and I had this great quote that the emotional context of where those exposures and tastes happen is super important. And if it's a positive emotional context, they make those positive connections with food. And this researcher who reviewed all these studies on exposure said, if it's a negative, coerced, fraught exposure, then they're likely to not have good feelings about that food and want to eat it in the future. So you may get a bite of cucumber in bribing with dessert, but they're not likely to enjoy and eat those cucumbers when it's up to them.
That actually makes a lot of sense. And I feel like that's not discussed, because I think it is really important that the context of how the experience is happening is really important too. One of the things that I really enjoyed reading about that I have felt kind of passionate about is the idea of you might not like it yet. I have definitely said that to my daughter before, but then I changed it and I said, you may never like it though. And that's okay. I like to tell her too of things that I don't like. I'll say, you might not like this and you don't have to like everything. And I think that's something that we forget in children, is we think that in order to be a quote unquote good eater, they need to like everything. But if we take a step back and look at our own eating patterns, there are certainly things we don't have a preference for. And I don't think that makes us a bad eater, but something about it in children becomes this label, and everyone wants to have a quote unquote good eater because that gets a lot of praise externally. And one of the things that I think is important that I've noticed with my daughter is by telling her, you don't have to like peppers. You might not, you might like it someday. Who knows? Maybe you do. Like the other day, I told her a story about how the other day I didn't really like peppers. And then my husband made a peppers lunch for like a dish for lunch. And I ate it and tried it. And I was like, wow, I actually kind of liked it. And she said, really, you liked it now? And I said, yeah, it was kind of different. I was not expecting to like it, but I decided to give it a try. And that's what happened. And she has not tried peppers. I don't expect her to try peppers anytime soon, but I do feel like it does instead of forcing the yet, it allows the thought process, at least to me, maybe you have a different opinion. It allows the opportunity for it to feel like this isn't the way it's always going to be. I think sometimes kids get stuck on that. Like, I don't like that food, and therefore I'll never like it. And I think if you open up their minds that their palate can shift and that there's flexibility there, that it's okay to not prefer a food and have foods that they prefer, and normalizing that a little bit. And at the same time saying, sometimes that changes when we least expect it. I'm 38 and all of a sudden I liked a yellow pepper. Who would have known?
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are great messages. And it sort of flips this, popular mantra now of like, they have to try it 10 times before they can decide if they like it or not. And so the one thing I say to be careful about in the book is, what's your intention with what you're saying, and how often are you saying it? And I like the idea of like, well, you don't like it yet. Fine. But what I see is like every time the child, well, you don't like it yet, that sometimes these good intentions can turn into pressure if we're saying it at every meal. So if every meal you're giving a mini talk about like, well, you don't like it yet, but I didn't like it, and someday I will, and someday you may or may not like it, then if it's every meal, and I'm not saying it is for you, but that's where we fall into this trap as parents, because we've been told that we have more control over this process than we likely do. And there's this anxiety of, I've got to get these 10 tastes in, so I'm going to say all these things to try to make that happen. And that, even the attention can backfire. So if you have a really anxious eater, or there's been a lot of attention, I wouldn't say the words yet to them. Well, you don't like it yet. And I would really pull back on if you're doing a lot of stories. And again, this is the question parents ask themselves. I just say, pause at the table. Why am I saying what I'm going to say? Mm-hmm. Is it to get them to try the peppers this time? And I don't think that was your intention. And then responding to her, she asked questions back like, oh, that you liked it this time. That's a conversation. But if we're going into saying things, and I do this a lot. This is like, we're told to narrate our lives to our kids. So we're constantly talking. So it feels very natural to have these conversations and talking and sort of teaching. But really learning to like new foods is an experienced process. And the more we talk and try to lead and guide and encourage, the more that they feel like there's attention on me, which some kids don't like. So they'll resist or push back. I can't do it. This must be really hard if there's this much attention to it. So, and it gives them things to push back against. So if you have a child who's really strong-willed and wants it to be their idea, their way, their time, that doesn't help either. So tongue in cheek, I sometimes say to parents, when in doubt, shut your mouth.
I love that.
And because for me, that's not natural either. So I had to sort of do that mantra to myself too. But, and this takes patience. Like, I have a daughter, she's 17 now. She eats a wide variety, but she's very particular about how she likes things. So she, and for example, we had salads show up at dinner for 6 years. So she had more than 10 exposures to salad. She never ate lettuce, but she would pick some of the vegetables off the top. We called them goodies. So here's the salad bowl. This is like how this might work. I'd say, do you just want some goodies? So then she would put a cherry tomato or peppers or cucumbers. She put a few things, but never tried the lettuce. And then one day when she was 6, she put some lettuce in her bowl. And that's where you have to bite your tongue and be like, oh, you're trying lettuce. No, just shut your mouth, like just observe. And then she ate it and she was like, oh, I like salad. And I went, oh, okay, cool. And it wasn't like, I knew you would, and that's so great, and salad's so good for you. It was just like, we give them the space to explore at their pace. And I guarantee you, if I had tried to get her to eat one bite of lettuce for the years that she was exposed to it, it would have been fighting. She probably wouldn't have then tried the other things from the top. And so this is the hard part of this. This is often the patience and the waiting out, when our entire culture and every Instagram thing will be telling you, no, you got to do this. You have to train their palates. You have to make this happen. And what we're doing really is setting up the environment the scaffolding for their skills, their capabilities, their curiosity to emerge. And one last thing I want to mention, that, we see a lot about gentle parenting and natural consequences and all of these parenting trends that I think are wonderful. And somehow, though, when food comes into the picture, it's like we put our gentle parenting aside and say, well, now I have to make X, Y, and Z happen because it matters so much to their health. And it's somehow food is separate from how we parent around other things. And I observe this with friends with small kids. Like, we're spending the whole afternoon of offering choices to kids and respecting when they go out without a Coke. Oh, they'll get cold and then they'll learn and it's okay. And then suddenly the meal starts, and the relationship, it's like watching the shades go down on this lovely sort of supporting the child's autonomy. And then suddenly it's half an hour of battling over that bite of the homemade pizza before the child can have the strawberry ice cream, and how many bites, and then it's fraught, and that joy, that connection goes away, the child's whining, the parent's unhappy. So I want to encourage parents who are exploring gentle parenting and these ideas just to remember that feeding our kids is part of parenting in general, and we can use those same strategies. We don't have to somehow treat it as different. So anyway, that was just an observation.
I love that. We're gonna wrap up here in just a second, but I love eating a nice piece of humble pie. And so I want to share this with everybody because it's a really great example of what you're talking about, and my lack of the letting the natural consequences happen, and that the difficulty. And I talk about this all day long. I'm an eating disorder nutritionist, health at every size, weight inclusive, anti-fat bias, like the whole thing. And it still is a struggle. So go gentle with yourselves. So Elodie and I, my daughter and I, made chocolate chip banana bread the other day. And it was a fun experience. We made it together. We had such a great time doing it. And at dinner the other night, she said, I'd like to have some of the banana bread. And I said, yeah, sure. No problem. Here's everything we're having. Banana bread can be part of it. And then she kept going back for more banana bread and wanted more banana bread. And my husband, Casey, looked at me and he goes, I don't know what to do here. And like, he just said that out loud. I don't know what to do. And I said, I'm struggling too. And I said, we're not going to do anything. And so I just let her keep eating it. And then later she turned to me at bedtime and said, Mommy, I think I have a little bit of a bellyache. I think I had too much banana bread. And I said, that's okay. The good thing about belly aches is they go away. I was like, I bet you'll wake up in the morning and you'll feel perfectly fine. But, maybe next time you can decide differently about the banana bread. And then the next morning, my husband was going to get a piece of banana bread. And she goes, watch out, Dad, you might get a bellyache. And I turned to her and I said, he knows his belly and you know your belly, and you learned something new today about your belly. And it was so hard to not say, you're going to get a bellyache. Stop eating so much banana bread. Like, don't do it.
And I've been at this for 15 years. And like 2 months ago, we were having breakfast. And for some reason, I always feel like I have to offer a fruit or something, smoothie or fruit with breakfast. And, my daughter is a very capable eater, and I don't know what she had, but there was no fruit there. And so I stood at the fridge and I said, do you want to offer yourself a fruit? And she busted out laughing and was like, okay, Mom, do I want to offer myself a fruit? And I just was, so that was like the joke for 2 weeks. So I've been at it for 15 years and I still my anxiety of like, she needs a fruit, or like I have to put a fruit on the table, or I've failed at breakfast. Like it's still there. And so yes, be gentle with ourselves. And there aren't really mistakes. And I love that you didn't frame it as a mistake. Like, oh yeah, you ate too much and you feel bad, so don't do that next time. And the next time banana bread comes up, it's resisting that urge to say, oh, remember last time you ate so much banana bread, you got a stomach ache? Like, they'll figure it out, and we're here to support that. So yes, it's very hard. You will slip back. Listeners, we all will slip back to that anxiety, that pressure, and then we just start again. It's okay.
Thank you so much for coming on today. This was such a wonderful conversation. I feel like there are so many topics that we could dive into together. So I think I'll have to email you to have you come back on again. But do you want to share where people can find you or anything that you have coming up that you want to be broadcast here?
Sure. So I'm on Instagram at Katja Rowell MD, so my first and last name, and I do lots of little reels with little tips. And thefeedingdoctor.com is my website. And if you're struggling with with picky eating, or what you feel is more extreme picky eating, helping your child with extreme picky eating is a great resource. And yeah, and hopefully in the next 6 months, I'll come out with a version of Love Me, Feed Me for parents raising their biological children as well, with neurodivergence and sensory differences. So I got a lot going on, but
You do.
it's really satisfying. And to me, I think as a physician, it's first do no harm. And I get really upset when I see preventable suffering. So that's what I'm trying to do, is really is prevention. Like, there's enough suffering that we can't necessarily escape, so let's not add to it.
Thank you so much. What a great message. And we look forward to having you back on with all of the fun things you have coming up. So thank you.
Hey friends, it's Dana, and thanks so much for listening to the Wholehearted Eating Podcast today. Find us on social media at Wholehearted Eating Pod on Instagram and at wholeheartedeating.com for more information about working with Dana and Christina for one-on-one nutrition counseling. If you love the show, we would love you forever if you'd share an episode with your family and friends, or tag us on social media, or leave a 5-star rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts to help more people find the show. Check out patreon.com/wholeheartedeating to help support the show and get access to ad-free episodes, bonus episodes with us and our guests, episode discussions, new resources we're creating for Patreon, and so much more. If you have questions for us, feedback on the show, potential topics or guests you'd love to have on, shoot us an email at hello@wholeheartedeating.com, and we'll see you next week.